Hey, and welcome to the highlights of episode number 253 with Dr. Thomas Verny. Some of my favorite parts of this episode were when he shares the incredible story of life in the womb and why everything a mother eats, drinks, inhales, experiences, thinks, feels, and worries about can have an effect on her unborn child. This blew my mind. I also loved it when he spoke about the biggest issues for pregnant women, and they're not what you're thinking. And I also loved it when he gives us the most effective ways to de-stress and why this is incredibly important. But there is so much more wisdom and inspiration that you get in the full episode. So to listen to the full podcast and get all the info in the show notes, head on over to melissaambrosini.com/253 right now. Thomas, welcome to the show. I am so excited to have you here. Now, you have created so much in your lifetime.
Yes.
You are prolific. So can you take us back and tell us your story and how you got into this work and how you got to where you are today? How did this all unfold for you?
Well, when I was very young, when I was actually 14 years old, I read Freud's interpretation of dreams. And it really just sort of resonated with me. I just really loved that. And so I decided then and there to become a psychiatrist. Then I studied medicine at the University of Toronto, which is a very good school. And so then I thought, well, this was in my last year, just before, like we had 6 years of study, and this was in my 5th year. And during the summer, I decided that I would go to work in a large psychiatric hospital in the United States. And I went, and they had very, very few doctors. It was a population of about 5,000 patients. Like, this was before we had tranquilizers and antidepressants. And essentially, most of the people were just being warehoused. So they asked me, where would you like to work? And I said that I would like to work in the emergency department where new patients were brought in. And so that's where I started working. And I knew very, very little psychiatry. But from my readings of Freud, I knew that you're supposed to talk about dreams. So I started to talk to my patients about their dreams. And I started to see their mothers and fathers and wives and husbands. And very quickly, the word spread that there was actually a doctor here who talked to patients, because none of the other doctors talked to their patients. They would spend about 10 minutes with them, prescribe them some medications, and left the rest up to the nurses and the orderlies. So within about a week, I had this long lineup of patients in front of my little office wanting to talk to me. And my patients started to do better. They did better than any of the other doctors' patients. And, they were discharged from the hospital within a couple of weeks. And when I saw this, I could see that psychiatry really was much more than just serving rich ladies with their poodles. And so I decided to go into psychiatry. But I did have this obstetrical background, you see. And so when I started working in my office as a psychiatrist after I finished all my studies and got my degrees, once in a while, I would ask people about their early years. And I became quite interested in the fact that some of them seemed to remember some very, very, very early experiences. So, for example, one of the first things that happened to me was that a young man, in the midst of discussing his dream, suddenly started crying like a little baby. And I did not interfere with him. I let him do that. After about 10 minutes, he came out of it, so to speak. I asked him what happened. He said, well, just a few minutes ago, I was a little baby, and I was in a baby bed. What's the word? It's not coming to me right now.
The cot?
Yeah, okay, something like that. Yeah, there's a better word. But anyway, in a little baby bed. And then he said, being a somewhat skeptical young lawyer, there's something wrong with this picture because he says, well, I I just saw myself in a blue cot. And actually, I've seen pictures of myself as a baby, and they were always taken in a white cot. So there's something wrong here. So I said, well, why don't you go home? His mother was still alive, and talk to her about it and come back next week and tell me. So he came back next week and he said, well, this is absolutely amazing. My mother says that when I was born, they did not have enough money to buy me one of these cots. And so for the first few months of my life, I spent them in a blue cot, which was a borrowed cot. And only then my parents bought me a new one, which was white, and that's where all the pictures were taken. So I thought to myself, well, how is this possible? I mean, this kid, this person remembers the color of his cot. Nobody ever told him this. Where did he get it? But I was very well educated. I went to Harvard University. I went to the University of Toronto, and I was always taught that babies before the age of 2, children before the age of 2, can't remember anything. So I really didn't give it a second thought. But then gradually, more and more experiences of this nature happen. I will just tell you one more. Is that okay?
Oh, please.
Oh,
Absolutely.
okay. So what happened was that I had a good friend who by this time knew that I was interested in really very early childhoods. And she said she was listening to the radio, and Boris Brott, who at that time and still actually is a very famous Canadian conductor, was being interviewed, like you and I are doing it right now. And towards the end of the interview, the interviewer asked him, "Tell me, Boris, how did your musical career start? What started you?" And he said, "Well, I think it started in the womb." Well, everybody, of course, stopped, and everybody was kind of excited and surprised. And so the interviewer and whoever else was there asked him, "Well, tell me more about that." And he said, "Well, when I first started practicing conducting, sometimes before I even turned the page, I knew what the notes of the violin were. I didn't know that with other instruments, but with the violin, very often I had somehow this feeling, without ever having studied the score, that I knew it. Somehow it was familiar." So he said, "Well, then I went home and spoke to my mother, who is a violinist, and I told her which pieces seemed so strangely familiar. And she said, those were the pieces I practiced while I was pregnant with you."
Wow. So, one of the things that I have heard you talk about is
Mhm.
that anything that the mother eats, drinks,
Yes.
inhales,
Yes.
she experiences, the stress that she's exposed to, the feelings that she has, the
Yes.
thoughts that she thinks
Yes.
can affect the unborn child. So, can you talk to that? Because I know a lot of people, when they fall pregnant, they might, look after their diet. So they might, start eating organic food, but they're not, they don't take into consideration the stress that they're exposed to, or say, for example, the products that they're using. And you believe that it's anything that they eat, drink, inhale, experience, the stress, the feelings, the thoughts, the emotions, everything. So can you talk to that for us?
Sure. Stress produces adrenaline, noradrenaline, cortisol. All of these stress hormones have a very toxic effect on the brain. What we have to remember is that during the early stages of pregnancy, 250,000 neurons are produced every minute of intrauterine life. Because so many are being produced and because they are so immature, they're also very vulnerable. And what research has shown is that if there is an increase in the brain of cortisone, if there's an increase in toxic products such as nicotine or any of the other sort of recreational drugs, they first interfere with the wiring of the brain. Every neuron is genetically programmed to go to a certain place in the brain. And so when there is too much cortisone, when there is too much nicotine and all the other things that people inhale and imbibe, those substances will interfere with the journey of the neuron, which starts in the midline and moves towards the periphery of the brain, which is why it's called the cortex. So cortical neurons are the neurons that we do all our thinking with. So if there is a high ratio of these cortisone and other stress hormones, then let's say a neuron that's supposed to go from place A to place B doesn't actually reach point B in the brain. It might go to C or D or E or F, doesn't matter. But it will not go to where it's supposed to go. It will be short of that. It will not journey all the way. If there is a lot of cortisone, if, for example, there is chronic stress, chronic low-level stress, let's say in a 16-year-old girl who has become pregnant, doesn't even know who the father of the child is perhaps smoking, is perhaps drinking, doesn't know what she will do with the child. When there is this kind of chronic stress, actually thousands and thousands of neurons will actually be destroyed. So when this child is born, his or her nervous system is not going to be normal. From the very beginning, okay, his computer is not functioning properly. And that's what people need to understand, that that poor child already is handicapped from the word go.
Okay, so say someone is pregnant right now and they realize that they have stress in their system or that they're easily stressed. What can we do? Like, what are some of the things that you recommend for people who are either pregnant right now, who are dealing with stress? What can we do?
Okay, let's differentiate between people who are already pregnant and those who want to be pregnant. Because for the people who want to be pregnant, I have sort of different advice than from the people who are already pregnant. So, for the people who are already pregnant, do everything you can to decrease your stress level, which means that, for example, if you are in a very stressful job, perhaps you can ask to be put into a less stressful job with the same company because you're pregnant. People will understand that. If you are in a relationship which is stressful, try to resolve that. Either get out of it or try to make it better. Try to find at least half an hour, preferably an hour in a day, where you can meditate. Try to find time to go for walks. All the research shows that nature is very, very good for your nerves. Lots of research has been done comparing, for example, people living in large cities with people living in smaller places where they are exposed to trees and flowers and grass. Huge difference. So being in nature as much as possible, meditating in any which way that you can, doing yoga, listening to classical music if possible. If you don't like classical music, listen to good music. Just don't listen to hard rock, okay? Don't listen to music that is angry, that is loud. Try to think of your child, okay? try to find out what that child looks like when he or she is 6 months old or 7 months old or 8 months old, and then try to communicate with that child.
So, is there anything else that we can do to prepare ourselves to really limit our exposure to stress?
I think the first step would be to recognize what stresses you. And I think that's very important. And again, this is something that you could discuss with your partner. What is it, because sometimes your partners know more about your stresses than you do. So, discovering, first of all, what are the stress factors in your life, and then see which of those you could ameliorate, modify, or even, do away with, omit, totally, cut out. I think
Yeah.
that would be helpful. Like I said, preparing some good music to listen to, getting signed up for some yoga lessons. There are yoga lessons for pregnant women pretty well everywhere. I'm sure there are in Australia. And, just preparing yourself. I mean, so many people think only of what they will do with the baby after it is born instead of thinking about the first 9 months. These are usually very, very competent women, and they are very proud of the fact that they can multitask. And so once the baby is born, and let's say that they are breastfeeding the baby or bottle feeding, doesn't matter, but they are very proud of the fact that they can be on the telephone while they are bottle feeding and cooking perhaps at the same time in the kitchen and bottle feeding the baby. This is not how you should feed the baby. This is very, very destructive. When you hold the baby to your breast or when you are bottle feeding the baby, it should be just you and the baby. And you are looking into the eyes of the baby, and the baby is looking back at you, and you have this incredible contact with the baby. And that's how the baby develops emotionally and intellectually best. It's very, very important to totally focus your attention, the mother's attention, on the baby for those few minutes. This is not the time to multitask.
When my mother had me and my siblings, she would just breastfeed. But nowadays, we are so addicted to our smartphones that a
Yes.
lot of women are breastfeeding whilst they're
Yes.
scrolling Instagram
Yes.
or
Yes.
on social media. So,
Yes.
what effect is that having on the child's emotional and mental development?
The women that you talk about don't realize that that child is really a small person. Imagine, holding, let's say, a 12-year-old child in your arms. I mean, would you feed that child and speak on the telephone at the same time? Probably not, right? But because it's a baby, you can do it. Just like, there are certain things that you perhaps would expose animals to that you wouldn't expose people to. So part of the problem is this lack of understanding of the mental and emotional development of these very young children, that the mothers don't recognize that there's really a little person there with a working brain, and that they're taking in the fact that they are not being given full attention. And not being given full attention, well, it can create all kinds of feelings and thoughts. They may be very immature thoughts, but they are the beginnings of feelings of inferiority. I'm not important is the message that that child is getting when the mother is multitasking. I'm not important. And that is being conveyed to the child in 100 different ways. The mother, let's say, talking on the telephone to somebody else, or having her eyes on something else. All those things tell the baby that he or she is not the most important thing to the mother at that moment. And that's what is very, very troublesome.
Oh, wow.
Yes.
And how has all of this work affected the way that you parent?
I think that a lot of this work really happened after my children were born, unfortunately. But it has affected the way I treat my grandchildren. So they have benefited from it more than my own children.